Hello and welcome to the fifth in the series of bite-sized webcasts on management commentary. My name is Megumi Iijima and I am a member of the management commentary project team. In this last bite-sized webcast in the series, we'll discuss some of the terminology used in the management commentary exposure draft. Previous webcasts already covered some of the terminology. In the second webcast, we explained what is meant by the term value creation. In the third webcast, we touched on the terminology related to disclosure objectives. We also explained the term key matters in our fourth webcast. In this webcast, I'd like to focus on some of the other language choices made in the exposure draft and clarify the questions that we hear about in that respect. So, in this webcast, I'll answer one of the frequently asked questions that we've heard. Why doesn't the exposure draft use the same terms as the conceptual framework? This question typically is raised by the preparers of financial statements. They are familiar with IFRS standards and the conceptual framework, and point out that management commentary is part of general-purpose financial reporting, and so the same concepts should apply as in preparing financial statements. To answer this question, we need to look at the intended audience of the proposed new framework. The board recognizes that preparing a management commentary may involve various individuals with diverse backgrounds who are not necessarily financial reporting experts involved in preparing the company's financial statements. So, some of these individuals may be unfamiliar with the terminology in IFRS standards and the conceptual framework, and may not widely use or understand some of IFRS technical terms. In addition, some terms used in financial reporting may be misunderstood in the wider context of a management commentary, and we will look at some examples later in this webcast. The board seeks to make the proposed new framework accessible to the wider audience. Therefore, in developing the exposure draft, the board used plain, non-technical language and simplified some of the terms by more everyday labels for some of the concepts in the conceptual framework. Now, let's look at some of the examples of simplified terminology that we were asked about in outreach. Firstly, let's look at the term investors and creditors. The exposure draft uses this term to refer to the primary users of management commentary, but it doesn't mean that the primary user group for management commentary is different from that for financial statements or for general-purpose financial reports. In the conceptual framework, the primary users are identified as existing and potential investors, lenders, and other creditors. But the exposure draft refers to the primary users using a shorter and simpler term, investors and creditors. Secondly, we also had questions about the term material. In the previous webcast, we already explained that in the exposure draft, the term materiality is used with the same meaning as in the conceptual framework and in IFRS standards, that it focuses on information that could influence investors' and creditors' decisions. Some stakeholders question the differences in the wording of the definition of material information. We underlined them on the slide. As you can see, the edits were made to tailor the definition for specific application to management commentary and to refer to investors and creditors instead of the primary users. Some also ask why the exposure draft does not use the term relevance. Here, I'd like to highlight that the conceptual framework explains that materiality is a company-specific aspect of relevance. The exposure draft asks preparers make decisions about what information could influence investors' decisions in the context of their company, not generally, so the board focused on providing guidance on materiality. Materiality is one of the attributes that are required for the information in management commentary to be useful. Let's move on to the next slide and consider other attributes discussed in the exposure draft. This slide sets out the terms used in the exposure draft to refer to the attributes of useful information in management commentary. Again, it is important to highlight that it is only some of the labels that are different from the terminology used in the conceptual framework. However, the underlying concepts are the same as the qualitative characteristics of useful information set out in the conceptual framework. We have already talked about relevance and materiality. We have also discussed the need to use a simplified language. The different labels for attributes used in the exposure draft were proposed to avoid the risk that the conceptual framework term might be misinterpreted in the broader context of a management commentary. For example, a neutral description of a company's strategy might seem inconsistent with describing management aspirations for the business. But a balanced description suggests that aspirations can be described so long as the risks of not achieving them are also explained. Freedom from error might be misunderstood as if it requires perfect precision in all respects, which could be particularly challenging for forward-looking information. So, the exposure draft uses accuracy and highlights that the degree of precision needed and attainable varies for various types of information. And understandability might be misinterpreted as an instruction to oversimplify management commentary. So the exposure draft instead refers to clarity and conciseness, which also helps to emphasize the need for focus in management commentary. One other difference you might notice on the slide is that the exposure draft does not refer to faithful representation. The board's research suggests that preparers of management commentary may not widely use or understand the term faithful representation. So, instead, the board proposes to provide guidance on the three components of faithful representation set out in the conceptual framework: completeness, balance, and accuracy. I hope this webcast has been helpful to you in understanding the terminology used in the exposure draft and why some of the language used is different from the conceptual framework. This webcast concludes our series of bite-sized webcasts on the exposure draft. We would like to hear your feedback on the proposed simplified terminology as well as on other proposals in the exposure draft. The comment period ends on 23rd November, and we invite you to submit comments via the Management Commentary Project page on the IASB website. Thank you for listening.